If you don't know what gaming in the Clinton years is, first off, I'm sorry you missed out on the funniest thing ever. And second off, I'm not gonna explain what it is, because it's funnier that way. Anyways, I've always found that stupid ass name, gaming in the Clinton years, funny, because it implies there are people who are categorizing video games by the president that was in office at the time they released. Like, who categorizes releases that way? Anyways, that got me thinking, it would be funny to do a successor to my first ever video on my favorite games for each year I was alive, where I would talk about my favorite game for each United States presidential administration. The one problem, though, is that for obvious reasons, there might be a bit of overlap with that video, so I'm going to make it so that only games developed by an American studio will be eligible for this video, making it a true 100% American video, except for the person who made the video, but you can ignore that. If a game was published by a non-American company, it would still be eligible, so something like Metroid Prime would be fine, although anything published by an American company yet developed somewhere else wouldn't be, so no Mass Effect. I actually feel like I generally lean more towards liking and talking about Japanese video games rather than Western ones, so I think this will be interesting. Let's see if we can finally answer the very long-standing question of, do the games made by Americans correlate to the quality of their president? I feel like the answer is no, but we'll have to see. And before you make a smartass, what was your favorite in the Washington administration remark? I'm starting this video with Jimmy Carter, who was president from 1977 to 1981. For actually good American video games released in that time, my only option is basically Atari. So I'm gonna go with Tempest. You know, I feel like Tempest 2000 is the one considered a cult classic. And yeah, it's awesome, but gameplay-wise, it's not too different from the 1981 original, because no matter what, it's a solid base. On the surface, it feels like it's a normal vertical shoot 'em up, and technically it is, but everything about it just feels so cool. The neon quadra-scan look is nothing short of iconic, and the sound effects are very punchy and capital H high-tech. It's simple yet addictive enough that there's a good reason this is one of the more iconic Atari things, alongside like Pong, Breakout, Space Invaders Port, and the 2600. It's just a fun time, and it's a game that's easy to lose yourself in. You have no idea what's even happening, you just know it's fun. Please buy Atari 50, anyone. Well, it's pretty annoying for this ranking that the Reagan administration covered literally all of the 80s. That's also pretty annoying for any decent person in the 80s to imagine. Well, this would actually start during and after the American video game crash, meaning most of the iconic games of this era, at least the ones I know, are British or Japanese. Like, there's actually a surprising lack of American companies who made NES games. I seriously looked through the Wikipedia list of all NES games and all that. Long story short, back to the Atari again, and I'm going to talk about Yars' Revenge. So, Yars' Revenge has always been such a weird game, just because of how non-straightforward it is. The game absolutely has the same energy as Atari's arcade games, with a simple format and simple gameplay, providing just as much simple fun as other games. But there's just that little bit of complexity in this title that makes this experiment pay off. An experiment to make something that feels like an arcade game, but could only be done on consoles at the time. Like, this is a game you need to read a manual to understand how to play. I just found this charming. It definitely doesn't have that same endlessly replayable factor other Atari games have, but that doesn't stop Yars' Revenge from still being a fun time. So, at the start of the 90s, we get the rise of more American developers, although they don't quite reach the heights of the Atari era. Stuff like Mortal Kombat and the Americans over at Sega Tactical Institute being the more notable ones during the time George Bush was president. I guess this is the point where I need to clarify, I'm obviously not actually saying these video games correlate to the quality of each president. The only political statement in this video so far is my Ronald Reagan dig. My choice for these years is probably the most predictable option, and that is Doom. This is one I've talked about, but I can talk about it again. So Doom is an interesting game, because while it's always fun, the first or second time you play a level, It's brutally difficult. After a while, though, it becomes second nature. Doom grabs you by the throat, Doom grabs you by the balls, and forces you to understand it. Without even realizing it, you'll remember enemy locations, secrets, and weapon pickups, and the game makes itself known to you. Each level is laid out with amount of care and knowledge of how the player moves and thinks. I was completely unknown at the time. The only other places at the time of Doom's release where level layouts were so intelligent are platformer games, like Mario, all in 2D. In Doom, you can roughly go where you want while still maintaining linearity, so that there's, still a game. When you do master this game, you end up feeling like the biggest, baddest in the world, even though it's not that hard at all. I've played shooter games I think are probably better than Doom, but Doom's winning formula is so good, I don't think I've seen anything that matches it in any other shooting game. Alright, so we're finally here, gaming in the Clinton years. This is a period covering basically all of the late 90s, where thanks to PCs, American games were very much on the rise. Whether it be FPSs like Quake or Half-Life, RPGs like StarCraft or Diablo, or even stuff like The Sims. Now, I'm committed to being completely honest in this video, and so if something actually is my favorite game of a time period, and is made by an American studio, of course I'm still talking about it, and that includes games I already have videos where I talk about it for like 15 minutes. I'm talking about Halo. I might not say that much. If you really care, you can watch my video on it. But I feel like oftentimes there's a bit of a stigma about the first game in a series. An idea that it won't be quite as polished as the rest of the series, or that it's not going to be fun to go back to. Halo Combat Evolved does kind of have this. Since it's a new series, there are multiple places where areas are reused over and over again, which can get quite tiring when this blatant padding lasts so long. And then that's like basically the only flaw with the gameplay. Yeah, that's barring like 2 or 3 segments. It's such a fun time that's excellently paced. I mentioned liking Doom's core formula, and I think a lot about Halo's appeal is based on its core formula as well. You gotta know your enemies, how they move, attack, how their weapons work, and for a game with about an average amount of story, that's a lot of world building. You get a lot about the Covenant and feel genuine dread from them just via gameplay. Later games would include more story and cutscenes, but I have to admit there is a charm in Halo 1's approach, emphasizing atmosphere and showing rather than telling, which future games don't have as much in favor of a more fleshed out narrative. This isn't to diminish the absolutely massive scope is Halo either, as it's still a massive game with tons of stuff in it. The reused areas are more there because of the scope being so big rather than devs being lazy. I don't know why I didn't put Halo in George W.'s term. Obviously, he was inaugurated in January 2001, so Halo released when he was president, and everyone associates him with that thing from 2001. But, let's move on. So, the period where George W. Bush was president basically marks the point where American games became just as profitable in the industry as Japanese games. COD became this stupidly popular thing, and the Xbox 360 was competing at the same level as the PS3. Insert jokes about how companies tried to appeal to Americans here. My choice for this time period is a game that defined this era and kind of a whole generation, Portal. I barely even know what to say for this game, because it's Portal. We all know Portal and how amazing its puzzles and writing are. The concept of a portal gun-based puzzles seems like it might run on ideas fairly quickly, even in a 3-hour game. You might say, no it doesn't, 3 hours is a really short time. But really? Think of 3 hours of puzzles using a concept like that. Ideas could run dry very quickly. That's why Portal is so impressive to me, because with just a fairly limited number of things, the puzzles still manage to be more engaging than games with 1,000 more mechanics. I think most people now consider Portal 2 the better of the two games. I guess there were like 3 others, but I don't think Bridge Constructor Portal is really in the conversation of best Portal game. Anyways, I've always liked Portal 1 better. Portal 2 is almost certainly a better game, but I've always found Portal 1 more charming. Some of the writing just feels a little more earnest, at least to me. Maybe it's because I didn't catch on as much, but lines like "I'm a potato" definitely feel like they're trying to be the next "the cake is a lie." Not to say Portal 2 is badly written, obviously that's a terrible take. I'm just saying Portal didn't really intend for its quotes to become memes. At least I think they weren't. It just happened because they were so good. Obobna is up next, and honestly, this is a complete toss-up between 2 games, but I had to give the edge to the one I haven't talked about yet. So I'm going with The Last of Us. My other option would have been Undertale, in case you were wondering. So there's a famous quote about The Last of Us, where the developers say the game was not intended to be fun. I think they did a terrible job with that. Okay, not fun is a bad way of describing it, but I understand what this quote is trying to say. The Last of Us is a brutal and unforgiving game. In gameplay, you get crushed, outflanked, and beaten over and over again, just barely scraping by. And in the narrative, the characters suffer, make bad choices, and experience a whole lot of loss. The game can feel extremely oppressive at times, but compared to lots of other similar pieces of media, it's not really suffocating. I think the stealth and action gameplay are actually pretty fun and rewarding. Sneaking past enemies and taking them out is fun in a way that makes you feel awful, that you're actually enjoying it. Not awful that it feels awful to play, but awful in a re-examining your relation to violence and making you think how far you'd go in a situation like this. Awful. And let's talk about the infamous ending. Let's just assume the Fireflies were 100% able to develop a cure to the virus by killing Ellie, which I personally think the narrative was at least leaning towards. Joel would absolutely be objectively wrong in doing what he did. But what about this world and the state everything is in would make you think our understanding of morality would still apply in this total collapse of order? Considering everything that's happening in The Last of Us, there's a reason the complex questions raised by this game's ending, and by extension the rest of the game, have resonated with people and provoked just so much debate years later. Heck, I debated the ethics of the ending with my mom. Granted, she watched the show. Post-apocalyptic scenarios are one of my favorite things to explore in fiction, because they give us that true exploration of human morals by testing them and bending them to their limit. We can say we'd give up a loved one to save the human race, but if you are truly in that situation, the rattling of the trolley getting louder and louder, who would really put their money where their mouth is and do it? I reckon not that many people. One other thing I like from post-apocalypse settings is atmosphere. Mostly how contemporary buildings are repurposed by future societies, and just how cities look in the future. In most works, what you get is rubble or deserts, because Mad Max did it. Even if the place has no reason to have a desert in it, because Mad Max did it. Looking at you, Face of the North Star. But The Last of Us is a little different. The Last of Us makes fucking Boston looks like the ancient ruins of a bygone civilization, and the empty ruins of American cities are 1,000 times more beautiful and artistically meaningful than any depiction of an American city at its prime I've seen in any game ever. There's also a heavy theme of reclamation by nature within the game, as plants grow in buildings and animals populate cities, which is very beautiful to see. And obviously the whole thing happened because of a fungus. I can't really explain why, and this will sound a bit silly, but the giraffe scene still feels like one of the most emotionally poignant moments in any video game ever. They're only there as a consequence for what humans have done, establishing zoos. And by all accounts, those things should be dead. But they're not. From what it looks like, they're thriving here. I cried at this part. Giraffes are cool, okay? Well, in the Trump years, I'm going back to a game I've already talked about, God of War. This game almost single-handedly made me appreciate Sony's games and their style of cinematic experiences. The emotional core is incredibly rich because story was a priority in this game. It's a powerful tale about fatherhood and grief. Some folks might prefer God of War Ragnarok, and okay, you probably think I'm comparing games too much, but I think it's worth it to highlight strengths of one game, and yes, I think God of War is a better story than Ragnarok. It's well paced and doesn't distract too much from Kratos and Atreus' character arcs, with too many other characters or stories. It's surprising how much this game pulls its world back compared to the absolutely huge Avengers Endgame event that is Ragnarok. There aren't very many realms, only one playable character, and the only Acer we see is Baldur and technically Thor. I like this, because it highlights how our heroes are outsiders, and it makes it so that the focus is always on them. The combat is fairly simple compared to combat in a lot of other games, and it might feel a little weird tonally juxtaposed with the story. You know, characters will fight for their life and not even mention it a second later, but it's deep enough so it's not like it isn't super fun and a great experience. Before this game, I thought all of Sony's games ditched gameplay in favor of a movie experience. This game disproved that quite quickly. And finally, we arrive at gaming in the Biden years. Well, can I tell you something funny? My favorite game of this administration is God of War Ragnarok. So, Ragnarok does take some focus away from Kratos and Atreus in favor of a more grand tale, but I think I was a little misleading when talking about it before, because that's implying they're not focused on at all, which isn't true. The arcs are complete in this game in a really satisfying way, and this game features tons of characters and plot threads. There are characters like Surtur who feel almost comically underdeveloped, only being there for the sake of the plot. There's one section that's like an hour long, just dedicated to showing Tyr a prophecy. You already know what the prophecy is, you just had to show him. And sections like the Ironwood one drag on way too long, but it's all in service of something quite powerful. The theme of loss of family is prevalent throughout all of God of War Ragnarok. Freya has a hard time forgetting Kratos and Atreus after the loss of her son. Same with Sindri, but with his brother. Angerboda doesn't want to accept she's losing her grandma, who, by the way, is the fucked up Icelandic Christmas witch that eats children. It's a pretty cool Norse deep cut. Thrud feels like she's losing Thor. A dog dies in like the first 10 minutes. And Kratos feels like he's losing his son to Odin. Throughout the game, you kind of feel like a family is forming, with Kratos, Atreus, Brock, Sindri, Freya, and Tyr. And just like so many other things, this is stripped away from us. Brutally. It's an emotional gut punch like no other. But once the war is won and the Odin and the Aesir are defeated in Ragnarok, our new status quo is bittersweet. Once we think about all that we lost, yet hopeful as we look to the future. Did Ragnarok fumble a lot of stuff trying to juggle so many plot lines? Absolutely. Did some stuff feel half-baked? Absolutely. And it doesn't really reach the emotional highs of God of War 4. But that doesn't mean it's a bad game. It's still amazing. And plus, all the combat from its predecessor is refined here, making for a slightly better experience gameplay-wise. God of War and God of War Ragnarok make for an extremely compelling duology, even if I do think it might have been better as a trilogy. And yes, that wait would have killed me if it had happened. So I think I have an interesting relation with American games, which probably happened because I was a Nintendo kid. Since the big releases on Nintendo were always different from Xbox and PlayStation, I missed out on a lot of the AAA titles others played a lot as kids that come from my region. Now it's like, oh wow, you discovered The Last of Us, good for you. But seriously, it's super fun to discover what all those foggy memories of TV adverts were really advertising, and all the classics I didn't have the console for. Plus, it took a while before I was actually able to play M-rated games, so there's that. As for which of these games I like the most, probably The Last of Us. So Abana is the best one? I guess. It's probably the better of these presents. Oh, no it is. I guess. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you later.